So, here are some of the topics I want to talk about with you. They are common concerns that people have. How do we think about earning money? What should we do about budgeting? What are guidelines for giving and spending? And how about saving for the future? Does that make sense, or should we just trust God for the future? And investing, something that's very seldom talked about from a Christian perspective, but there's actually a pretty important message here. So, the scripture actually has material on all of these. And I think if we turn there now, and I'm just going to give you a couple of verses that talk about each of these items. There's far more in scripture if you dig in, but this will get us going. So, earning. Paul, in speaking to the Thessalonians, says, look, aspire to live quietly and to mind your own affairs and to work with your hands as we instructed you. So we're not to be lax and relax and just trust God for everything. We actually have a job to do, work to be done, and we're expected to do that. As far as budgeting, so planning for the future and planning about how we're going to allocate our funds, Jesus says in Luke 14:28, for which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? So again, thinking through, what are the funds that I have available? Can I allocate it to this project and to this project and that project? That's budgeting. What about giving? Matthew 5:42 in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, give to the one who begs from you and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. So it's about generosity and giving to those in need. There will always be people who have less than we do, and we will always be able to help somebody. And it's a fundamental principle of Scripture, giving. In fact, Malachi talks about giving the tithe. 10% of what we have, we just give to the Lord for kingdom work before we do anything else. So that would be 10% of your gross, because it's the first 10%. And it's the only place in Scripture where God says, you can test me in this. You know how we're not supposed to put the Lord to the test? Well, in this one you can. Test me in this. Bring the whole of the tithe into the storehouse and see if I don't pour down my blessings upon you. Check it out. Spending. So James says, look, you ask and you don't receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. So there are good things to spend money on, and there's not so good things to spend money on. We need to be wise and know which is which. What about storing up for the future? Well, Genesis, Joseph speaking to the people in Egypt, and let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities and let them keep it. So this is the dream he had about the 7 good years and the 7 lean years. And basically he's saying, look, during times of abundance, you need to be storing up. You need to be setting aside funds for future times when it's going to get more lean. For most of us in North America, that means retirement. It's absolutely biblical and based on biblical principles to say, I'm not going to spend everything I have now. I'm not going to spend everything I could spend. I'm actually going to save for the future because that's part of planning for the future. And I know that the lean years will follow. Now, perhaps the Lord takes you home before you get to retirement, in which case you're going to save it up for your children or for kingdom advancement. But nevertheless, the principle of not spending everything we have now and saving for the future makes a lot of sense and has biblical basis for it. Finally, investing. Very few people talk about this from Scripture, and there's no command to invest specifically. But think about this in the parable of the talents. Matthew 25 says, to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his ability. And then he went away. Well, then he came back and said, well, how did you do? And the one that only had the 1 talent, which remember is a weight of silver. Okay, it's actually money. It's not talents. It's not gifts. That's the application of Scripture. The actual meaning of the verse is that they were given a large sum of money to do something with. And the one that came and buried it in the sand, Jesus was exasperated with him. He said, look, don't you know that I was expecting a return on this? You could have at least given it to the bankers and made some interest off it. Okay, that would be the minimum you could do, make a little bit of interest. But the other 2 that had the 2 talents and the 5 talents of silver, large weight of silver, all that money, they doubled it. And he said, well done. They did well with what they were given. In other words, they invested it, they expanded it. Maybe they built a business, maybe they funded a business, maybe they sold some things. I don't know how they did it, but the point is, that a parable only makes sense in the spiritual if it makes sense in the natural. And Jesus is basically saying, look, everybody gets this. Okay, if you were given a large sum of money by a master and you were the steward to look after it, then you'd want to do something well with it. You'd want to increase its value. So when he comes back, you can say, look what I did with what you gave me. And so investing and expanding our resources, increasing our resources for the future is a biblical principle. It was so obvious that Jesus didn't have to say much about it specifically. He just commended them for doing it.